During the years following World War I, Germany suffered greatly and were presented with many problems politically, economically, and socially. Almost overnight, Germany went from being the least democratic in Europe to the most. The Weimar government was a coalition government made up of 8 major parties. These parties ranged from Social Democrats and Communists to the left and People's Parties to the right. Proportional representation led to the development of weak governments, as creating a majority from which a chancellor could effectively run the country proved to be difficult. Proportional representation also allowed extremist parties like the Communists and the Nazis to gain political influence in spite of small numbers and lack of support. Another issue that was faced by the Weimar government in relation to politics lay in the Constitution, in which Article 48 stated that in a state of an emergency the President can rule by decree, ruling without the authority of the Houses of Parliament. As a result, presidential powers could be used and abused. Signing the Treaty of Versailles presented Germany with many outcomes that were far more severe than the people and politicians of Germany imagined. Germans were angry, saying that it was a dictated peace and it couldn't be negotiated. They were angry that they were the ones who seemed to be responsible. If the Germans didn't, however, sign the treaty, then the blockade would remain and Germany would continue to starve. To the people of Germany, the signing of the treaty was the Republic's first major betrayal to the country's people. Soon extremist attacks began against the Weimar Republic as a result of the Germans' anger towards the new government. Beginning in 1919 with the Spartacists, also known as the January Uprising. On December 13, 1918, the Spartacist Party declared themselves as the Communist Party of Germany. Mass meetings and demonstrations broke out in January 1919, particularly in Berlin, urging counter-revolution and the overthrow of the Yeahhhh government. Yeahhhh was at risk of losing the capital, and then the whole country. Many on the right wing still believed they could restore some of Germany's pride, and in early 1920 an uprising was started in Berlin by one of the leaders of the Freie Corps, by nationalist Wolfgang Kapp. The Kapp Putsch, which is said to have been a right-wing monarchist reaction, was supported by the army and the police of Berlin. It was an extreme attempt to overthrow the Republic and was fiercely against the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular, the military clauses within it. Yeahhh's government was forced to flee Berlin and called on the left wing to bring the Kapp Putsch to the end. They ordered a general strike, which was successful for the Weimar. The Kapp Putsch lasted no more than a few days.
There is nothing quite as wonderful as money. There is nothing quite as beautiful as money.
The Weimar government was faced with huge economic issues. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to pay £6,600 million to the Allied countries, crippling the German economy. In 1923, Germany could not afford to pay out, and later that year, the country hit its lowest, and hyperinflation sank in.
If you got the money, I think it would be funny.
In an attempt to get their money, the French marched into the German industrial area known as Ruhr. The government reacted by asking all German workers to strike to prevent the French from getting any money. This was called passive resistance. 150,000 workers were removed from the Ruhr, and in riots and protests many were shot. Industrial production in Germany ground to a halt. The German government continued to delve deeper into bankruptcy, so they developed a solution that seemed simple: print more money. The price of living dramatically increased, and as a result, so did the wages, to keep up with the price of general goods and services. Therefore, more paper had to be printed. The more money that was printed, the more diluted its value. Eventually, money became worthless. This is where hyperinflation comes in. Alright, so let's put hyperinflation into perspective. To understand the incomprehensible scope of the German inflation, maybe it's best to start with something basic, like a loaf of bread. So in the middle of 1914, just before the war, a £1 loaf of bread would cost 13 cents. 2 years later, it was 19 cents. 2 years more, and it sold for 22 cents. Now the fun begins. In 1920, a loaf of bread soared to $1.20. Then in 1921, it hit $1.35. By the middle of 1922, it was $3.50. At the start of 1923, it rocketed to $700 a loaf. 5 months later, a loaf of bread went to $1,200, and by September it was $2 million. And the next month, it hit $3 billion. But by mid-month, it was $100 billion. And then it all collapsed. Many Germans suffered greatly from hyperinflation. These were people with fixed wages and people with savings. Although so many people suffered, there were some who benefited from hyperinflation. Smaller farming classes, for example, as food was always valuable and farmers could increase wealth through barter. In September 1923, Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor. This was the only way Germany could return to any semblance of normality. Under him, Germany would prosper in what was to become known as the Golden Years. Stresemann called off passive resistance and promised to pay back reparations, and in November 1923 introduced a new currency to end inflation. Having gone through a period in German history where there was various attempts at revolution and a fiercely struggling economy, German culture suffered greatly. Public confidence was at an all-time low. However, during the 1920s there was a remarkable upsurge in cultural life. National morale rocketed for the first time in nearly a decade.